So I'm going to talk a little bit about automated vehicles and try to talk a little bit about what might today's vehicles tell us about the future, whether it's automated, autonomous, or as my friends at Veoneer, Ole Bernstrom sitting in the front seat who got me here today, talk about collaborative driving. We've talked a lot about in recent years about how we're going to infuse and fuel AI into the driving sphere. And there's more AI in cars and more zero ones floating around vehicles today than ever before. So let's start with class participation. Who thinks that our quest for driverless vehicles began in the last 10 years? Show of hands. Keep them up, please. 20 years. 30 years. Getting higher. 40. Keep them up. 50. 60. 70. First context of driverless cars in the news is nearly 100, kind of about 90 or so right now. 1926, we were going to control a car with a remote control with no driver. The context of driverless cars in the Milwaukee Sentinel is where you can find it on Google. In the 1950s, GM invested a fortune in the context of trying to develop Autopilot. It's not Tesla's term. Go back to YouTube. I didn't bring the video today, but you can find some wonderful clips from the 1950s of Autopilot traversing the highway. In the 80s, GM continued those investments, but it was really in the 2000s where the US Department of Defense infused a lot into AI, trying to understand warfare operations against robots, that our modern revolution of robots on our roads began. Google, an organization with almost a limitless budget, decided, hey, this is a good area to begin to invest in the future, and took a major team from that effort at DARPA, put it together, and started what we now know as the Waymo program nearly 10 years ago. Now, while the world has moved faster and faster at spending billions, if not close to $1 trillion today on automated vehicles, Waymo, one of the leaders here, is fueled by almost a limitless budget that Google has. Think nation-state decision systems here. Not an organization that needs to make money in 6 months, 3 months, 12 months. An organization that is looking to fuel profit margin 20, 30, 40, 50 or more years in the distance, where you're not clicking on ads on your browser to the same degree they are today. So as I said, class participation matters. Can the modern automotive industry keep up with that level of investment? Those of you who say yes, please raise your hands. That means we can't compete with Waymo. And Google's vision here is not short-term, but the modern automotive industry has been chasing this since day one. We can't let Google win. Well, in some sense we can't, but we may not be able to afford to compete. So the problem here is that through media hype and a lot of other forces, we've built this bubble. What do I want as a consumer? Take me to work. Take my parents to the doctor. Please take my kids to school. The problem here is, though, that AI-fueled autonomy in the vehicle is way more than getting from point A to point B. The door-to-door problem is probably the biggest problem. If you're an older adult with mobility issues, or even kids, how do you get them from the front door of the house into the car? Or better yet, if you were to take an Uber or a taxi and need to get packages from the trunk to the house, the driver is far more than an individual to pilot you from point A to point B. So that means as we fuel AI into the driving sphere, we're going to need to do more than move the car from parking lot to parking lot. That means the cost predictions that GM has fueled the world with on low-cost mobility, well, they may not be there so much. And high tech doesn't compete with low tech in terms of cost for a long time. I'm not saying that the future isn't autonomous. It very well might be. But our quest to get there is going to take some time. The capital requirements here, we're starting to realize are way in excess of our early projections. We can remember only a year or two ago when there were multiple OEMs going to release level 4 autonomous vehicles on our nation's roads in the US by 2020, 2021, 2022. Those numbers are starting to get pushed back, kind of moving over the hump on the Gardner cost cycle. So Wall Street pressure here, when we're not making our returns or not making our projections, what's going to happen? Well, there's going to be some leadership changes, consolidation, overspending, and capital markets that are already in some sense beginning to dry up. The hard part here, that our roads very well could get riskier on our way. Why? We've been focusing on replacing the driver as opposed to developing the systems to collaborate with the driver. Then I'm not saying that long term we're not going to see robotaxis or other autonomous agents on the road. It's just an investment question. When billions don't grow on trees, it takes time. The hard part here is that we have no clear goal. Autonomy means different things to different people. As I wrote it in my Forbes post a couple months ago, to some, this is an autonomous system that allows for hands-free driving. Many of us would be thrilled if we didn't have our hands on the road and we were able to do a little more while we're moving down the road. To others, hey, it's seamless intermodal connectivity. How do you get me to public transport? Because public transport has a lot of efficiencies. We all know in much of the industrialized world that Uber has changed the face of congestion by lowering the price point of transport. Moving around a city like Las Vegas during CES has become a bloody disaster. So finally, from a country such as Sweden, where safety is a model, perhaps a safety target, where 1.25, 1.3 million people are losing their lives globally at the expense of automobile accidents. A technology solution that could take a bite out of that, 5-10% a year, would be magnificent. But things mean different things, and we as a global society have not set what our targeted goals here are. Now, the hard part in the US, and this is read by a lot of media problems, is there's an enormous amount of confusion about what is self-driving. 23% of respondents in a survey we had last year said, hey, you can buy a self-driving vehicle at the dealership today. There's no self-driving vehicles that we can buy or see operating on public roads except for some shuttle buses moving at extremely slow speed. 8.2 people believing they or someone they know has driven in a self-driving or ridden in a self-driving vehicle. Fueled by the media hype here and the confusion around what is self-driving. Is Autopilot self-driving? A Tesla's future? No. Is Pilot Assist Super Cruise? No. They're collaborative systems where we as humans have a responsibility. And the AI is completing some of the activities in the vehicle. So this points to the real problem in the need for rethinking how we look at autonomy in vehicles. The Society for Automotive Engineers a number of years ago proposed a 6-level system to describe from 0, no automation, to 5, fully autonomous, anywhere a human would drive system. And some of the confusion is we as humans can't figure out the gray. Perhaps the best we can do is understand I am responsible as a driver. I am in the vehicle as a rider. Moving the language of automation to driving and riding. Now, from an engineering perspective, the levels might be fine because engineers can speak a different language, think a different language, and design for a different function than the average consumer can understand. The key here being, if you're setting in an AI-fueled vehicle, you know what your responsibilities are at any point in time. To drive, we have 100 plus years of history there, or to ride, sitting in the back of a taxi cab, bus, etc. And the key here being, only when we begin to clarify our roles is the confusion model here going to reduce. And confusion on the road of what our responsibilities are is not going to lead to increased safety. So there's a lot of models today that say that hands-free driving, here an illustration of the Cadillac CT6 with Super Cruise, is the future. And I, by and large, pretty much agree. Because I think that relieving some of the operational demands of driving is wonderful. Makes things a lot easier, more comfortable, more convenient. But the question is, how safe is this? Is it safe enough? What are the risks? National Transportation Safety Board yesterday just released a report on the Tesla Model 3 fatality from March 1st of this year. Strikingly similar to an accident 3 years approximately ago, with the first automated vehicle fatality where a car drove under a truck. Well, 2 accidents of the same nature in a period of time. I'd love to know the statistics. Is that safer or is that more risky? And we don't have the exposure data to begin to fully understand these trajectories. We're getting there, but we need to get there faster. Only if we build trust in this new mobility ecosystem, where AI and computation is moving us around, will we get there faster and save the lives we want to. So one of the hard parts here when we think about AI-fueled automation in the vehicle is that when we design systems, whether they're algorithms or they're bumpers or they're passive safety systems or active safety systems, we as engineers look at the specifications. We say, these are specifications we can build something to. We make engineering assumptions. That's what we do as engineers. We do the best we can within the bounding box of where we have to work. Unfortunately, when we take these technologies and we give them to consumers in the real world, the rough roads outside, whether that's cobblestones or potholes in Boston, the benefits of many of the systems that we project are often not as strong as we'd like. Why are systems not utilized effectively? Why are they underused? Why are they overtrusted? How do we begin to understand, how do we build systems that work for almost everyone? Some of the things that we begin to understand when we study advanced driver assistance systems and automated driving systems in the field, we understand that in many cases, individuals just don't have the skills necessary to interact with the technologies. It's a myth that with more automation comes less need for human expertise. It's a myth. The more you automate, the more you need to educate how, when, where, what. Many systems require driver management and oversight. So as I said earlier, the confusion between self-driving and collaborative driving. Thinking about what my responsibilities are to oversee this high technological system moving down the road. Technologies often assume that I'm ideal. I'm going to do what I'm told. Well, Swedish drivers are a lot better than US drivers. A whole lot more predictable than those in China or India. But how many of you do what you're told all the time? Probably not as many of us as we'd like. Finally, the infrastructure is far from ideal. So we have a crumbling infrastructure in the US. We do not have a strong investment in the road infrastructure. That means bridges are falling apart and there are more potholes than we'd like to talk about because snowplows, road salt, really don't mix together. So that means that AI-fueled technologies that requires a robust infrastructure isn't going to work too well when it encumbers a 3-foot crater in the road in the middle of the winter, or quite frankly, still in the spring today. So when we look to the future, how do we begin to understand the underpinnings of where past ADAS and automated driving research, which is strong research, really fits into the holistic nature of how actual customers are beginning to use actual technologies in the real world, and using that information to bring it back into the design and development process earlier. Because only when the mental model of the design team overlaps with the mental model of the consumer are we going to get appropriate technology utilization. When the design team is not thinking the way the consumer does, we either need to move the design towards that of the consumer, or we need to educate the consumer to bring them towards the designer. Otherwise, underutilized or overtrusted technology will result. So a number of years ago, we began to realize this problem and said, if we're going to leverage technologies in cars how we'd like to, we need to begin thinking about how people are using these systems in the real world. And today we have 14 organizations working together, including a few here from Sweden, Volvo Cars and Veoneer, to collaboratively work together around trying to collect data around how people are touching real technologies in real cars to understand where they are appropriately using them, where they are not choosing not to use them, and to try to get information on their behavior with these technologies back earlier into the design and development process. A number of the organizations we're working with are also using some of the data we're collecting to bring that back into their labs and begin to do some of their own interrogation of the results, to try to understand how do we build better systems faster. The key being here in the automotive industry has long benchmarked itself about what technologies are in each car, whether it's a radar from organization 1 or organization 2, or an interface from organization 3, or crash tests, looking at how functional safety systems perform under duress. The industry has not benchmarked itself too well on the impact of these technologies on the consumer. While we are all different, there are advantageous design elements and less advantageous design elements. How do we pick those elements out and bundle them together? So how does the environment, the operational characteristics of the road infrastructure that we live on, need to come together with the technology characteristics and the characteristics that the human in the trusted technology, perception, expectations come together on the real road? And we can begin to try to understand that through observations about what's going on in the vehicle. Now, we can all think back for a moment to situations where we're doing things in cars and they do things that we expect. These are, in fact, highly complex technical systems, fueled by a larger degree today than yesterday by AI. So what are we touching? When are we choosing to touch that? When are we self-selecting to use a technology or saying, you know, that's not something I'm so comfortable with? We use technology as part of our lives, but yet the foundations about how we move down a highway are embedded into the back of our brain almost as well as reading a book. And for some way, we get from point A to point B safely most of the time. So from a data perspective, we've logged over 500,000 miles of data in Level 2 equipped vehicles today. Level 2 vehicles are ones that have collaborative driving systems, and this very well may be the largest data set in the world collected by a third party, not a manufacturer or a supplier, that is being used today for research around collaborative driving. We spent a lot of time looking at owners of Teslas, watching for more than a year, in some cases close to 3 years. Colleagues of mine in the lab here leading this effort. Lex will talk a little bit more of this in a moment. How are people threading autopilot into their lives? Looking at a benchmark vehicle we started early on with, a Land Rover Evoque, a well-integrated traditional safety system with a level 1 feature. Moving to Volvos with Pilot Assist, where we'll talk about the software changes that have occurred in these vehicles in a moment, onto the Cadillac CT6s with Super Cruise, which is really the penultimate of hands-free driving today. Not because of the technological characteristics of the vehicle, but because of the attention management and the motivation system built in to ensure that we are collaborating appropriately with the technology in the car. It's an intuitive, well-designed interface. In essence, it's way beyond the deep learning and machine learning algorithms. It's how the technology integrates with us. So let's think of some videos.
Nice.
Ford Collision Alert's been around for years. The first time you experience it, this is really cool technology. It warns me when something's getting too close.
Hoping I could get one of those.
By the 15th, 20th time, 100th time, 200th time, the human brain is beginning to tune this out. Over-alarming has been well known in hospitals to elicit no response. We stop hearing it. So the answer must be add more automation. That'll solve the problem. Lane departure warning systems didn't work, so we added more automation. We built lane keeping assistance systems. That'll solve the problem. Because by golly, technology is the solution, isn't it? We like to look at it. We like to feel it. So yes, automatic emergency braking does work.
Finally, in 1880, the British government legislating that all timetables in Britain must.
For those of you who experienced AEB, I'm going to play this again for you. It is a lifesaver.
Finally, in 1880, the British government.
So notice in this individual here, and I'll play it for one more time because it is a good one. He is looking at the road. Mind wandering, maybe. We don't have a port to the brain to tell. So even when you have individuals that are partially attentive to the road in front of them, AI-fueled technology can help. Here's a video of Volvo's city safety system, which is a lower speed automated braking system designed for cities. The Insurance Institute of Highway Safety in the United States has clearly shown safety benefits to this technology. But watch this individual's face as the vehicle's stopping for itself. Already getting used to the bounding box and the protective barrier that the automation is providing around them. So the question becomes very quickly, if we get too comfortable with this big bumper that's been built around us, and the bumper is imprecise, are we going to miss things more likely? We'll cover that a little more towards the end. So finally here, another video. And it's a long one because it's hard to cut. This is an individual who will talk and do a beautiful job of annotating this for us.
Oh, next Tuesday, 5 to 8. What?
What is that?
I don't know. No idea.
It's a forward collision alert.
I'm just gonna ignore it.
Just going to ignore that.
0.3 miles.
So playing with the phone, car is beeping. That's the
So
parking
what are you
system.
gonna do for supper, Timbo?
You can hear the subtle
Are you
beeping
all
here.
set? Alright, 'cause we're not gonna be much between once we,
Again,
no.
in Sweden here, we wouldn't
Once
eat
we
and
miss,
play with our
once we
phones
get on
sitting
80.
at lights, correct?
I mean, once you get on 76.
Wouldn't do that stuff.
Yeah,
No,
that's
not-
an idea,
not acceptable.
huh? Nice raccoon.
So I want everybody to watch as the car in the top right quadrant begins to accelerate forward here.
What? What are you beeping about? That's the car beeping. What the heck is it beeping at me about? I can't hear you. Whoa, what was that?
It's your brakes.
I know it. What did that mean?
Brake failure.
Come on, Tim, stop it. That sure was my brake. What was the problem?
Floor mats.
Wow.
So this is Volvo's
But
and
there was
many
no
other
sign
manufacturers
saying
have
the
this. It's
brakes are
called the brake
bad.
boost function. Automation decided she wasn't
Ooh.
braking hard enough, amplifies the braking force, but provides very little indication to the human what's
There's nothing
happening.
under there, George. No.
And this is a classic situation
What,
where
Tim?
we see confusion in vehicles
Yeah, I know,
because
really.
we don't understand what this automation is doing around us. As I mentioned
don't
earlier,
know.
with automation comes a need for education. And consumers being utterly confused about
I mean,
the
it was definitely
automation
beeping at me, but-
technologies that are being infused into the world around us.
Maybe there was something on
Because
the
the
floor
assumption
in there, but I didn't think so. I would have
Being
felt it.
we can automate
Yeah.
without the necessary education. So since we really need education today, in the US marketplace, it's a little crazy what people do in cars. And it's not surprising that when we relieve the operational demands of driving through automation, whether that's power steering or automatic transmissions, because as I said, power and automatic, what do humans begin to do? Free resources. When I don't have to shift, I have a hand to text. When I don't need both hands on the wheel to tug that steering wheel around a curve, I can take hands off the wheel a little more, even when I don't have truly lateral supporting automation. So sit back for a couple seconds and watch some clips about what people do on the roads in the US and recognize that this isn't Sweden.
I have a feeling I just sat right up the
Notice they are all moving videos.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I'm calling you from the car.
None of this happens in Sweden, right?
I'm sorry, I just there's a lot of traffic right now. So like it's just so annoying.
Just to make you passive safety folks happy. Put a projectile
Siri,
between
can
the
you look
ballistics.
up Len's Crafter's phone number in Billerica, Mass?
Is this within the specifications for the vehicle? Taking notes, absolutely, with a hands-free driving system. Gotta have your music. Be healthy.
Sorry didn't bloom yet though down in New Jersey.
Playing Pokemon Go?
Steps. How did I get so many?
I need my coffee. It's the middle of the night in the East Coast.
If you try, you fail, move on. That's life, so.
And last week I was getting emails from the White House press shop saying,
Because I was bored and I went to this pizza place with this really cute guy, and
And my favorite. None of this happens here, right? Not at all. So I shouldn't do any studies to do comparative work here between the US and Sweden. Now, some of what's going on here would have been infeasible a few years ago. The context of not understanding that if there is a place to not put an iPad in a car, it is on the airbag in front of you. While it is incredibly low risk that that airbag is going to go off, the effect of that projectile with an iPad launching towards one's face or body is not a pretty sight. So how do we begin to think about this? How do we begin to move the consumer from one who's using the liberties of automation, because I don't need both hands tugging at that wheel anymore, to move that to a little more appropriate use? So let's look at a little data for a little bit. As I mentioned earlier, we're working with some Tesla vehicles with Autopilot, and about 300,000 miles of data and drivers in these units. And here we have Autopilot engaged, blue cyan, overlaid on top of manual control in red, just superinfused. A great plot from Lex here on the Eastern Boston map. What we first notice is that Autopilot's being used a lot here. About 32,000 periods of time in our data set. Distinct periods of time where the automation was turned on and the automation was turned off. Traffic-aware cruise control, where you're only getting longitudinal support, about 16,000 times. Where we're driving sort of the old-fashioned way, about 71,000 times. This is an enormous amount of interaction between the human and the vehicle at varying levels of automated support. Lots of theoretical work going on around transfers of control, how humans are giving responsibility to automation. This is 25,000 plus naturalistic transitions of responsibility. About 1,400 times where the forward collision work goes off. 12,000 times where the lane departure warning goes off. Interestingly enough, only 3 times where the automatic emergency brakes go off, but 362 times where the driver slammed on the brakes greater than 0.65 G. What's really interesting about the Tesla vehicle here is that the engineering between the safety systems and the automation systems is actually much more ubiquitous than a lot of the other vehicles out there. So periods like forward collision alerts, lane departure warnings, forward collision alerts and AEB events aren't happening with the automated driving features. Why would you get an auto alert when the automation is responsible? In many other consumer vehicles, the safety systems are built in one part of the organization, the automation systems in the other part of the organization. So you give responsibility to the automation, expecting that it's responsible for something, only to be warned that the vehicle in front is stopping too fast. Creates a whole lot of mode confusion or role confusion. What's my responsibility? And Tesla's actually doing a much better job than average managing that. So we have a sample here of about 38 drivers who self-selected to be in an MIT study, who were purchasers of high technology, lead adopting electric vehicles with advanced automation. This is a bias sample. This does not represent the general population and how they'd use this technology. We can't do that unless someone has a whole lot of money to give everybody in the audience a new Tesla vehicle to drive around for the year. So within our data set, individuals are using Autopilot for around 35% of the miles traveled. That is an awful lot of automation use. In essence, the folks who use Autopilot are using an awful lot. That's what makes all the sporadic crashes we hear about in the news so difficult to understand. It's being used a lot. Nothing should be perfect, but everything that happens with automation is going to be a news item. So where are the risks? Are they higher than us, by ourselves? Are they lower? In the middle? Safe enough? Don't know. And these are the hard societal ethical dilemmas that we need to face as we bring AI into the home, into the car, into the workplace. There's no easy answers. Governments are going to have to lead the way. It's not my decision. It's a societal decision. It's a societal risk issue. Now, individuals are using this for about 15% of the time. That means we're traveling fast and, not surprisingly, using the automation by and large most of the time on the highway. Now, what's interesting about Tesla's strategy here is that there is a bunch of use off of the highway. Can't figure out the pointer here. So here at slower speeds. These technologies are by and large built to work on the highway within what was called an operational domain, or operational design domain, ODD, for those of you who are in the auto systems. And what's interesting about the Tesla system is that we believe strongly that folks are using Autopilot off of the highway, out of the regions it was designed. And by using it out of the ODD, they are experiencing failure in the system more frequently. They're learning to calibrate their trust outside of where it's designed. It's an ethical dilemma. How do you learn to use a system outside of its where it's designed, some sense from a design perspective, irresponsible, without any educational support? How do we learn to use AI appropriately, calibrating the trust so we don't overtrust it or undertrust it? If we just had the technology accessible where it works pretty well on the highway, do we fail to calibrate trust appropriately? How do you think about that in healthcare, where the alarms in an operating room or in a patient's suite are going beep, 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 day in and day out? So we spent a lot of time with Autopilot looking at the periods of time where humans decide they want to drive again. And we could talk about this topic for hours, but we only have a few minutes today. So let's talk about situations where driving along supported by longitudinal control and lateral control. Conceptually, probably supposed to have our hands on the wheel a little bit, but many of us do and many of us don't. So when we look at this, we see that individuals are really proactive when a curve ahead is coming and we're not comfortable in the system, or we don't think the system will be able to handle it. When cars, pedestrians, or objects appear, some of them quite suddenly, we've always been there when a pedestrian steps out between cars. About 50% of the time, we're proactive. We see it ahead of the time, and we disengage the automation. Other times, we're reactive, doing it quickly after. Lane splits, lane merges, we see them coming, we're proactive. When the automation gets too close to a barrier, reacting afterward. What's really interesting in some of Alexa's work here, really intriguing, is that we seem to react to the technology faster than many of us would expect. We seem to be more vigilant than the literature would classically define. And the reason for that is that we're functionally making some of the decision when and where to use the technology. We're not monitoring collaborative driving systems in the automobile like we are a radar scope where Mackworth's vigilance theory would play. That's really hard, really boring, and really difficult. Why would I subject myself to that? So what we're doing is turning on the automation when periods of time we want to be a monitor, or periods of time that I want to relieve the workload, and we're turning it off at other periods of time where I want to drive. And it is very much in that self-regulation and the decision-making process of when I want to be a monitor and when I want to be a driver that I think the bulk of the auto industry has missed the boat. The fact is, we as humans want the liberty to decide. Maybe some point in the distance we're willing to give that up. But right now, leveraging that decision, perhaps expanding Autopilot where I think it would be responsible and bringing driver monitoring and driver management into this. I think Tesla's quite irresponsible here. Amplifying the fact that we are attending to the road, but allowing us to make the decisions of when we want AI's help fully or when I'd rather be driving on the California coast with my hands on the wheel. Why else would you want a high-performance vehicle? So we can look at situations very quickly here. Here, with a number hits 0, the car moving slightly towards the guardrail, the driver quickly taking and pulling it back in. Oh, and I, as we traveled down the highway with Autopilot Assist, experienced one of these yesterday. Happens in all vehicles of this class. And one more where an individual is choosing to use the technology where the weather isn't so great. Same thing, moving left, quickly bringing the vehicle back on. We can begin to study thousands of these events. So what's really intriguing here is that once every approximately 9.2 miles, an individual is having a complex disengagement. Tricky for that matter. In essence, the automation isn't perfect. And the fact that the automation isn't perfect requires that if we want to survive, we are going to pay attention. There's a quest right now in the auto industry and many other industries to make AI more perfect, to automate better. That is an open question if that is the right answer until the automation is really, really, really good. Because if it is unpredictable to a degree and does fail, we are not going to overtrust it to the same degree. If Autopilot was nearly perfect, Pilot Assist for that matter, and we drove 10,000 miles between failures, we wouldn't expect them, and all of a sudden we'd be tuned out watching a TV show. I see some heads going up and down. Now, that's not to say that aren't instances in this data set where people do drive an hour without failure or the desire to take over. Just by and large, we're using this technology for shorter periods of time to relieve workload when we're trying to do other things. And largely the same results are there with other automated technologies on the road. So let's change directions for a moment. We are by and large in a Volvo town. So Volvo released their Pilot Assist system to the market a little over 2 years ago, about 2 years ago. And in the US shores, we got a different product than here in Sweden. Because, and again, in Sweden, the roads are a lot different than they are in the US. We don't have road lines this well most of the time in the US. So we did a little benchmark test between 2 software versions. One version A that was released to market, version B, which was released about a year later through a dealer-delivered upgrade on a really good section of road. And the availability of the feature substantially increased between these software updates. Okay, great. It's not over-the-air updates, but it's dealer installed. We're improving the quality of technology post-production. It's a great thing. The interesting part here is Volvo provided no education material that we changed the foundations of this system in the vehicle. So for those individuals who bought Pilot Assist and didn't use it because it didn't work so well when it was initially released, there was no cue to say, hey, try this technology again. It's much better now. Okay? Education here being a fundamental requirement. So what's interesting here is that when we begin to look at some of the data, so we're now actually working on version C, and what they're selling at the dealership today in the US would be best categorized as a version D. I'm sure for those of you from Volvo here, there are much better internal names for this. Okay, and these are by and large very overt software changes. There may be minor ones in the middle here that we can't tell. So the context is simply adding automation is not necessarily the answer. So on the left here, Land Rover Evoque. Very simple. Assisted cruise control system used by individuals about 5.5 hours on average a month. Okay? Inferior radar-based cruise control, 3, 4, 5 years earlier technology than what is in the Volvos, which is a radar vision fuse system. So the Volvos have a better technology by any of the technology specs. When pilot assist didn't work so well, not surprisingly, it doesn't get used. But there's a negative carryover effect, perhaps, over to ACC. When pilot assist improved, absolutely, people start using that. But notice the carryover over to ACC. The hard part here, and I'm not going to go into details, is that 50% of the Volvo Pilot Assist users believe that it operates in one way. 50% believe it operates in a different way. So when the designers and the consumer's mental models don't overlap, we get confusion and we don't get appropriate utilization. So that's not to say that the designers were wrong. They weren't. They had a vision. That's fine. But if the consumer doesn't understand that vision, we're not going to go anywhere. If you didn't understand how to interact with your smartphone, would it be as useful of a technology? No. So, just to give you a flavor how consistent vehicles can be, let's look at radar-assisted cruise control here. The monitoring of costs, frequency in which you look at the instrument cluster, increase about 50% when you're driving under assisted cruise control. The radar is controlling the distance to the car in front of me. Okay? This is not a good thing or a bad thing. This is reality. We are looking at the instrument cluster to try to assess the state of the automation. The automation requires monitoring. Anybody want to guess what happens when you bring lateral support in? With pilot assist, the monitoring costs go up to about 200%. How is this supporting me? An interface telling me down in the instrument cluster. Well, the good news is that many Volvos are delivered with heads-up displays. That's good, at least it brings the information up. But it's an option. So one question becomes, if the monitoring costs are that high, do you need to fuse the heads-up display with the automation to ensure that if we're going to monitor, because we as humans are visual learners, we look. Even when I'm talking to you here today, I'm looking to connect with you. When you talk to a voice system, you talk to Siri, you look at it. The foundations of how we communicate. Well, glances to the interior of the vehicle also increase about 70%. We can guess what that is. When we free resources by adding automation, we begin to do other things. So, in another vehicle, we were looking at active safety, forward collision alerts here. 84 out of roughly 1,900 collision alerts are actually related to an imminent object in this vehicle. In essence, there's a whole lot of nuisance alerts going on, bothering us, but not related to objects we are actually going to collide with. That's a lot of alarming. Haven't we learned something from hospitals where the alarms are going beep, beep, beep all night and nurses are ignoring them? But yet, how do we infuse the safety capabilities here, balancing the frequency in which we alert to optimize the characteristics of the automation, not necessarily just moving on to a better sensor? How do we ensure that we are appropriately alarming and alerting? We can look in more detail and just give you an example where these are occurring, where they're happening in city streets, in intersections, on the highway, etc. Beginning to say, okay, what are the characteristics? Because the complexities of global design are immense. If you build a technology here in Sweden and deploy it in the US, testing across international boundaries to the degree it's needed are very difficult. The data that needs to fuel this, in some cases, can't leave the country. I love talking about China in particular, where you're literally required to keep the data in China, or GDPR issues where you can't move it out of Europe. How do you do that when you really need to combine some of it together to try to build a ubiquitous algorithm, or you end up with these regional-based algorithms because you can't combine the data you need to? If we want to move the AI-fueled worlds further faster, we have policy issues that need to be solved to enable ubiquitous data movement, to build the technologies. Whether it's a deep learning algorithm or a simpler vision algorithm, they all need to look at different colors, different shape data. So unfortunately, As we bring AI into the car, and as we touch the steering wheel less and less, there's a couple lessons that we can learn. So first of all, vehicle miles traveled is beginning to diverge from vehicles miles driven. Where I first developed this slide in 2013, VMT was equal to VMD. When we traveled, we were driving. At times today, we are no longer driving the old-fashioned way. We are literally collaborating with the automation. In the distant future, or not so different future, depending on what your vision is to automation in the car, vehicles miles traveled will diverge significantly from vehicles miles driven. What that means is that we are no longer going to drive. We are going to watch and ride. We as humans are experiential learners. That means we learn by doing. If we're not driving, we're not learning. The unfortunate part of much of the quest towards autonomy in vehicles right now is we are assuming that the human will be there as fallback. The Federal Aviation Administration in the US has long recognized that pilot skill is eroding at the expense of automation. That is where you have a training program and training regiment to protect those in the aircraft. So the driver's skill is going to look much more like a novice driver in the future, and we all understand that risk. The unfortunate part is we don't know who's wrong and who's right. You know, in some subset of individuals, no matter what we build, we're going to abuse it. There's a history in cars. It's from racing. And we still see in the streets of the US, people trying to race cars, drive as fast as they can. Why the heck else would you need a speedometer that goes up to 150 or 200 miles an hour? Because many of us still like to step on the gas pedal and feel the acceleration behind us. It's difficult engineering for everyone. It's even more difficult fusing together the engineers with the marketers to try to deliver something that was built for a population. The future of this industry is one that is increasingly software-centric. That means microprocessors may need to change like the tires on your car. A car might have a usable life far greater than the chipsets that they were delivered with. Software is the fuel that is going to transform change. Our expectations as a consumer are going to benchmark the strengths and weaknesses of a vehicle purchase, a vehicle brand, on how that technology improves post-production. We don't buy a smartphone now expecting it to have the same apps, same features 2 years after purchase. I expect I can download, update, and revise. That means there's a lot of things that need to change as we move forward. We need to look at training individuals when they get the car. We need to work on the reliability, cybersecurity issues associated with transforming critical updates to vehicles through the airwaves. When we make those updates, re-educating. We look at the aviation industry right now and Boeing's problem in the 737 MAX. Huge education problem, combined with an automation technology problem. Learning from the skies is not perfect, but there is a lot we can pick up on. Data sharing and value-added partnerships critical. Can each individual player collect the data that's needed here? It's a big question. How do you reduce that cost and burden? How do we train everybody from the sales force to the marketing side to the engineering side on thinking ubiquitously? So I've argued, and I argued in a TEDx talk I gave almost a year ago, that we really need to be thinking beyond the state of practice, working together to meet shared goals. This is almost as big as the engineering feat when we began to think about and modernize the manufacture of automobiles. This is a big transformational change. It's not a small one. It's an evolution towards autonomy on our roads, not a revolution. And this evolution could stretch another 100 years for the automotive industry. And that is not saying that there won't be robots around. It's just going to take a long time to change. I've argued a little bit that a risk-benefit model, more clinically oriented, much like the drugs that we take and the pharmaceutical products that we buy, may be strategic here when we think about safety. Looking beyond engineering standards to continual process improvement. When we build a standard, we engineer it to a standard. We don't look at building better every day of the week. industry-wide safety culture similar to aviation. Unfortunately, I do work with auto manufacturers that have safety culture problems. Individuals in the organization that are not willing to speak up or capable of speaking up around system problems, where the AI engineers or the electrical engineers rule the roost. Electrical infrastructure to automotive has long been a champion of power in these companies. Powertrain is another one. How do we give the power to stop the assembly line or to stop the assumptions to all? Policy leadership is critical. We can't do this as an industry alone. As I talked about earlier, there are ethical dilemmas in here that have to be solved, and that can only be solved from a regulatory perspective. A single automobile manufacturer cannot make the big ethical decisions that are needed here. And finally, these changes, again, will take decades. So humans are going to have a role to collaborate with the AI-fueled technologies for some time. It's not to say that we're not going to have some robo-taxis around, whether that's here in Gothenburg or in Arizona, San Francisco, or Beijing. They're going to come. But it's going to be a long time before that changes how I live and move. And the price point of that mobility gets cheaper than a taxi cab. And if it does too quickly, and the projections of GM come true that, hey, AI-fueled mobility will be so cheap, it'll make living and moving so much easier, all we're going to see is gridlock and congestion. Policy will have to stop it. And we already see that to some extent in New York City, where the taxi commission is limiting Uber licenses. Why? The congestion is too bad. We as humans prefer moving by ourselves than moving in much more efficient public transport. Human-centered engineering throughout the automotive ecosystem, the healthcare industry, the telecom industry is critical. How do we fit with the technology? Let's build technology that supports us. Let's be collaborative in thinking about how we can build AI technologies that help us live better lives. How do we feel better every day about the technology supporting us, as opposed to frustrated when it's doing things that we just don't understand? And finally, how do we get global policy working together? This isn't a US versus Europe problem or China problem. This is a transformational problem that we need to develop internationally. Why? The cost point here and the potential to save lives is huge. And only if we work together can we realize these changes. That means that the folks in industry who hate talking to each other, let's think Ford and GM, need to go to President Trump, like him or not, and say, we need road lines on our roads, and we need the potholes filled. Otherwise, we can't solve the problems that you're looking for. So I'll give you a personal story on how bad this is. My father and my girlfriend both own BMWs with low-profile tires. And they've each had 2 flat tires in the last 6 months. Because low-profile tires, again, simple technology, no AI involved here in the act of driving, maybe in the design there is, hit potholes and explode on US roads too frequently. I'm not saying the design's wrong, but the infrastructure is just not going to support high tech so well. So with that, I thank you all.